Good morning. Today is Thursday, February 17th. It's 8:35 a.m. and this is the meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're resuming our work on S-148, an act relating to environmental justice. The work today is really looking at the continued editing that's been going on outside the room with A&R and CLF as representative of sort of the parties interested in advancing the bill from outside government to be going through a back and forth on features of the bill. So there are red lines, markups from both A&R and CLF, but Commissioner Walk, before we came on, you were characterizing them as largely, I think it was more editorial changes. So rather than have you go through a lot of small details, maybe it would be most helpful to us to focus on the major points of negotiation, the more meaningful changes. I don't know what to call them.
Sure,
Does that make sense to you?
I think it really is sort of one key feature. And so for the record, Peter Walk, Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. I wanted to, so in our discussion, what was that, Tuesday?
Yep.
It's all a little running together at this point.
Yes.
We discussed the timing challenges with seating an advisory council, getting the work done to be prepared to provide guidance that has 60 days of public input on it for the funding pieces. And so you asked us to develop an alternative calendar to make that more manageable. We have proposed that new calendar, which would essentially provide that guidance to state agencies on July 1 of 2023. Meaning we would have an additional effectively 6 months to get that work done. And then that would then delay that would change the timeline associated with the reporting on what funding has met that guidance accordingly from the same date of July 1, 2023 to January 15, 2024. No, yes, I had a blank. I thought we were still in 2021 for a moment there, and I was like, that seems like inappropriate dates. But so what effectively that does is still maintain that you are getting that information in time to make decisions that you as policymakers and keepers of the purse might want to make relative to that report. A July 1 report from a legislative process standpoint is about as functionally useful as a January 15th report anyway. So I don't think that change in timeline has a significant impact on your work, to my feeling. And that was really the major change. I would invite Caitlin Ellerman or Rachel Stevens from the agency to offer anything else that they saw as major changes that we made, but the rest were sort of the administrative changes and some cleanup of previous references that needed to be fixed based on changes that you've made. And so I think otherwise that was really where our changes were focused. But Caitlin, do you want to add something?
Sure, I will just describe a clarification made around in the rulemaking section, which we did have an opportunity to discuss with Ms. Mahaly. And that is that A&R originally was directed to adopt a rule to define and implement consideration of cumulative environmental burdens. And it was uncertain as drafted, sort of that limited language what was intended to be included in that rule. So we've clarified that the A&R rule will define cumulative environmental burdens and implement consideration of cumulative environmental burdens within A&R and inform the consideration of cumulative environmental burdens and the use of the mapping tool for the public and for other state agencies. And then in section 673B, the other agencies and departments will adopt their own rules, procedures, et cetera, consistent with that rule, A&R rulemaking. That was the most substantive change, I would say, in this last round of edits, aside from the dates.
So thanks, Galen. I appreciate you reminding me of that one. I think the key there was trying to make sure that the sort of authorities the independent authorities that exist within state agencies, and not assuming that A&R rules might be binding to the actions of those agencies, that they need to work to incorporate them into their own processes. That's especially true, I think, for the NRB and the PUC, as sort of quasi-judicial entities need to do that of their own accord. And so certainly the rules that we will draft, that we will promulgate around cumulative environmental burdens will be important to their overall analysis. It won't necessarily define precisely how they would do it.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you very much. Any committee questions for Commissioner Walk or Ms. Ellerman? Okay, anything more you want to add before we hear from Ms. Mahaly about CLF markups?
We're recalling one other change, really not to any text other than the location of the text. Under the rulemaking section, originally 6003, there was a requirement that A&R review the definition of environmental justice population and make basic and any other changes that might be appropriate and report to the General Assembly. That I suggested moving up into the EJ policy section 6002 as just a more general EJ policy topic, since we're not being told to do that through rulemaking.
Great. Well, thank you. Okay, so if there's nothing more, and I guess there is not, so thank you for that. I'd like to turn to Ms. Mahaly. We're going to do a screen share to show us CLF markups. Good morning.
Yeah, sure. Good morning. For the record, Alina Mahaly at CLF. I will share my screen. So I want to remind, well, first I should start off by saying that we really appreciate A&R's close review of the rule and correcting some inaccurate cross-references and really making sure that the language is tight. So thank you. And we don't have an issue with any of the red lines that were submitted by the agency today. The one place that I wanted us to revisit is our discussion around how we can make sure that this Advisory Council on Environmental Justice is given proper ability to really make sure that their advice is heard and helps shape the outcome of the ultimate rules that are used to implement the environmental justice state policy in this law. And before, in the first version and the second version of this bill, there was an opportunity for the Advisory Council to vote on rules. And I heard that this committee was uncomfortable with, and the Agency of Natural Resources was uncomfortable with giving this unelected body the ability to have veto authority over a rule. And yet I did also hear committee members understand that we do want to make sure that there are some there's some recourse and opportunity for dissent to be heard if there is disagreement in the advisory council. So I'm sharing my screen now with a proposal for a middle ground opportunity where we're not giving voting approval authority to this advisory body, but what happens is basically once the agency has worked with the advisory council through the pre-rulemaking phase, and they are kind of running a scoping version of the rule by the advisory council. Once they are finally ready to propose a rule, the advisory council votes on the rule, but that vote is not what's determinative of whether the rule moves forward or not. The only thing that happens is that vote is recorded, and it is included in the packet that is ultimately filed with both ICAR and LCAR. So those individuals on those bodies would see, okay, this rule was voted 8-7 in favor. And if more than 50% of the advisory council members object to a proposed rule, that just triggers an opportunity for a representative from the advisory council who objected to the rule to present before LCAR at the typical public hearing, the LCAR hearing that happens on proposed rules. It just gives them an automatic opportunity to show up at that hearing and speak to the reasons why they objected to the rule. And then the agency proposing the rule would show up and represent and attend to the concerns that were raised, respond to them. So again, this is not giving the advisory council veto authority. They are voting, but that voting is just to have a record of how the votes turned. And if more than 50% vote against, all it does is it provides an automatic opportunity to be heard before LCAR. And then section F here is basically just giving a little bit more detail of what kind of information should be contained in the administrative record when establishing rules. And we feel like this will help ensure that the advisory council and others have adequate information to really work with whatever agency is rulemaking to best understand the record upon which that rule is grounded.
Okay.
So does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that proposal?
Let me look to the committee first. I have a couple. Senator McDonald.
I was trying to write this out, but we are being asked to look at language that says, in the event that the advisory council majority votes not to send a rule to LCAR, that someone be authorized to go to LCAR to tell LCAR why LCAR has in fact received a rule that the majority voted against sending. Is that what I see?
Yes, the only thing that's different is when they're voting on the rule, they're not voting on whether to send the rule to LCAR. I think they're voting on whether they feel like the rule actually carries out the purposes proposed. And so in this case, let's take, for example, the rule that ANR has to issue around what the definition is of cumulative environmental harms. That is something that I believe that ANR will work genuinely with the advisory council to come to a consensus and a great rule. But in the event that there is disagreement and the majority of the advisory council thinks that ANR chose a definition that is not accurate and does not further pursue the environmental justice state policy, they would have an opportunity to basically object in writing to that through a recorded vote. And all that does is it means that once the rule does go before LCAR, it, as you said, here it lines up with what you said. A representative who objected can show up at the hearing and present to members of LCAR the details of why they objected to the rule and why they feel the rule doesn't meet the legislative intent.
So, Mr. Chair, as a colleague that serves on LCAR, I don't know if you and I have ever seen a rule come before LCAR where the people who propose rules, entities that had proposed rules, had voted against the rule, and then it showed up in LCAR being presented as if there had been a majority vote.
Okay.
I don't recall ever seeing that, but should such a thing happen, any member of the public can come before LCAR while such a unusual rule was being proposed to LCAR and say, and testify and say, hey, I was on the committee that didn't recommend this rule and voted against it. And LCAR, I don't know why you're considering it, because it was somehow hijacked by a minority and sent in. So I think we're getting into too many details here on something that isn't going to happen. If it doesn't happen, is kind of a violation of the whole rule writing procedure. And
So
I think if we could get back to some of the material stuff that we're trying to achieve, rather than getting into rather bizarre hypothetical situations, we might make better use of our time.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. I think let me just check in with the authors of this new language, because I think my understanding is a little different than the way you characterize it, Senator McDonald, that they will.
I am prone to error. I am prone to error.
As are we all. But my understanding here is that it will have been, for instance, ANR that will be bringing the rule forward, right? In this case, but it's the advisory council that's recording in a formal opinion, of the appropriateness of that formulation of the rule. So it's not the originators of the rule bringing in a rule that they don't have support, that they don't support themselves. It's the advisory council weighing in on the rule that ANR would be advancing, for instance, and just offering an assessment of how successful they think that rulemaking was. But as you point out, I mean, so is that right, Ms. Mahalik? It's not a dispositive vote. It's basically a formal assessment of the rule before it goes to LCAR to record the advisory council's position on the proposed rule.
That's right. And I want to be clear that, yes, a member of the public has the opportunity to show up before LCAR, but as someone who has engaged in that process, it does take a level of sophistication and being able to contact the administrative assistant, get on the agenda. And what this is doing is it's codifying a right to this advisory council to have that opportunity if they want it. And it's sort of just clarifying a clear channel for those dissenting voices to have an opportunity to be heard. So I think that the committee should see it as a pretty non-threatening setup that does not upset the current system, but just creates a very clear channel within a system that already functions.
Sure. And sub F, I don't know, maybe you and Commissioner Walk could both speak to sub F. We get as a LCAR member, along with Senator McDonald, we get a packet of information related to any rule that comes over. Does this represent some sort of enhancement to what that packet would include? Or is this all, the packet doesn't necessarily include this, but this is just the process within an agency, that the agency itself shall gather data, legal, scientific, technical information, et cetera, and then formally put it into their record.
It's the latter, and this is acknowledging that the Administrative Procedure Act is light in terms of describing what consists a record. And so this is attempting to put further detail on what is expected to be comprising the record here. This language is language that shows up in the Global Warming Solutions Act to describe the level of detail that's expected to be in the rules that the Agency of Natural Resources produces under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And we think it's good practice to spell that out further.
Okay, well, it's nice to know there's a precedent, right? So Commissioner Walk, really you're the area in this case most affected by the proposed change. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on both provisions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Ms. Mahali, for the language. I think I may be confused by the first change, but it does not feel to me as if that isn't a right that's available to those individuals now, as LCAR accepts testimony. And I worry that it sets the precedent that only one member of the majority voting bloc of the advisory council could present themselves in front of LCAR to provide testimony. So that piece is a little confusing to me, but as it stands, I don't think it's, if you would like to call out that is the right that is available to them, then I don't have an issue with it, because I don't think it, but I think we need to be clear on what it changes and what it doesn't. And then relative to the change in F, my recommendation would be that the filing requirements for the Secretary of State are in narrative. Typically, the record is in narrative form and does not include every piece of information that we have received or comment that we've received. I don't know if that's necessary for the purposes of filing with the Secretary of State. However, I do recognize that there's a desire to have that detailed record and have that be publicly available. What I would encourage is a separate process whereby we were to post and make available that information as part of our work around environmental justice and the sort of website work that we would create in order to do this work, so that it was clear and available to everybody. I think that, to my mind, is probably more effective and doesn't disrupt the Secretary of State's processes. I understand that that's the language associated with the Global Warming Solutions Act. That doesn't necessarily mean that I support that that's the way it should be done there either, since I don't think it needs to be part of the Secretary of State's record. I think that people will come to the Agency of Natural Resources to see that information. And if that information is available in a way that can be digested in a way where the record associated with a rule is not particularly easy to digest, I think would be a better way to serve the needs of the public.
If I may just respond to your feedback on the first part. So again, how do we deal with giving this advisory body some opportunity to record their dissent? I think you're right. I don't want this to be language that restricts them from participating beyond what they can do already. And so I hear that. And maybe it's about keeping the first section, which has them record their vote. And then the second part doesn't refer to 50%. It just says any of the objecting members shall have the opportunity to present on their objections at the scheduled LCAR public hearing.
Is there a way to, sorry to jump in on the conversation, Senator Brett, but I might suggest that there is probably language in the APA that we could refer to here. And maybe this is where, I don't know if Ellen's still around, typically say, sort of refer to any member of the advisory council can testify on their perspective on the rules relative,
Call back to
pursuant to the process that the APA lays out with LCAR.
Yeah, I don't know if the agency is required by the APA to show up. I think it's good practice, and I have always observed that if someone's planning on objecting to a rule, that the agency putting the rule forward shows up to defend it, if you will. But I think if that's not in the APA, that would be good to include here.
I would maybe this is for Senator Bray, but my understanding is typically if there is an issue raised and there isn't the ability to respond to that the decision on the rule will typically be delayed until such a response can be provided.
Right. The norm, as you all have participated. So if there is a concern raised, there's often we can go to a second or more meeting, delay things for parties to have further discussions, clarifications, et cetera. So, all right. So I think in terms of getting I like the idea of referencing current law, like APA practice, and citing that someone has the right to appear, for instance. So I understand the sort of the explicit affirmation of that right here, but without necessarily creating something. I'm going to be careful about the word right, but the specific affirmation of the opportunity to present and to be able to cross-reference the current APA law would seem that way we're not inadvertently creating something new that could have a wrinkle we don't know. The other thing is that I'll work with Ms. Murkowski and Ms. Dexter Cooper, who is really our APA expert and ledge counsel, to review this language, just to see if what suggestions they might have about. I think I understand your intent, and work with counsel to hear their suggestions on how to weave that in. On the second piece, F, that one's a little murkier to me. So
yeah, and I think I do want to be clear that in terms of priorities, it's much more important to us that we iron out the LCAR part that we were just talking about, and that we get this rule out of committee. If subpart F is problematic, I think the desire there is to try and make sure that the rule that is issued here has a detailed record and contains the list of things that we include in this sub F. And in the Global Warming Solutions Act, that's included as a subpart under the rulemaking section. So it's entirely feasible to put it as a subpart under this rulemaking section. You don't need to amend the APA, and I think it triggers the agency to the agencies that may be rulemaking under this rule to follow this standard. But again, it's not something that I would like to delay a vote on just for this subpart.
Okay, well, thank you. That's helpful. And I also notice in F, there's really two pieces. One is that first, that they develop a detailed record, and two, that it's included with filing. So maybe splitting these two, I'm thinking that any agency would now believe that they do develop a detailed record. If that's a judgment call, then I'm not quite sure how we specify it in a way that's satisfactory to both sides. Like, how robust or how thin is that record? But amending what's filed with the Secretary of State, then I think pushes us back into altering the APA process, and that I think could be more problematic. So thanks for the
May I offer a
latitude on
suggestion,
what
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Senator Commissioner Walk.
Please no. I would recommend that we strike the second sentence and simply at the end of the first sentence, add and make publicly available essentially to the first part and make said record publicly available, something along those lines.
Mhm.
That allows for the form of that publicly available to be determined at a time outside of this legislative committee, but make sure that that is part of the process.
Yeah,
Okay,
that works.
thank you.
There's just one other amendment that we wanted to put forward, which is on page 21, and it is about funding for the advisory council. And as we were discussing last Tuesday, this is potential language that could be included in Teal here to just, if in the future there is an opportunity. I mean, I 100% agree with Commissioner Walk. Like, we do not want to rely on private foundations to be funding this important work. Like, this is absolutely critical for our state government to prioritize and appropriate necessary dollars to. But in the event that there is foundation money, we wanted to include language to authorize the council to accept those funds if that's a source of additional funding for community engagement work. So this is language that I found in statute in Maine related to a commission that they have there on Indigenous affairs that allows them to accept funds. So I wanted to propose including something like this to just ensure that they have the authority to do that in the event that there are foundation dollars that want to support this. Or, I mean, it also says from a political subdivision of the state. So I think we wanted to also make sure that the mechanism was in place for A&R to pass through dollars to the advisory council that would go beyond per diem. And I know the fiscal note is still being generated, but we just wanted to make sure that there was a mechanism in place.
All right.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, I think as a concept, you know, my previous comments on this note notwithstanding, I think that's okay. My question is a matter of sort of public record. We get into some potentially awkward areas in here in terms of potential for advocacy and lobbying that might come up here. And I don't believe that would be the case, but I think there is that you could create the impression thereof. And I wonder whether or not it's appropriate to have the advisory council provide a report back to you on whether or not it has accepted a funding outside of what you've appropriated to it, so that can be part of the public record, just so that there is not any confusion or concern about conflicts of interest.
Okay.
Good point.
All right. So, Ms. Mahaly, maybe you could explore drafting a reporting requirement.
Yeah.
And it may be useful. Things are popping up in my brain, but there's obviously sort of, you know, existing lobbying requirements. There's also the work that this will come into play for those members the members of the council, because they'll be obligated to fill out one of the conflict of interest disclosure forms for their participation. And it should be made clear in that context that they received those resources as part of their work on the advisory council. And so I think I do think some time is needed with Ms. Murkowski about how to craft that in a way that doesn't create conflicts of interest around the disclosure of conflicts of interest.
Okay. I'm not sure how this would work precisely. Also, it feels a little unusual to read. They may accept funds, but we don't really have a mechanism for dispersing those funds. You know, I don't know how we're receiving and dispersing, which.
I mean, that's part of the issue here. And this is an idea to figure out how to do that, but I welcome others.
Sure.
I worry about a situation down the road where because they're not state government employees, that there could be a problem with paying stipends. So I'm trying to make sure that we just.
Right. Well, I certainly appreciate.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator McDonald.
Mr. Chair, if this provision goes in, the bill goes to appropriations. The Appropriations Committee can write what the witness asks to be written in their sleep. They will probably have their Appropriations Committee assistants present the amendment without even being asked. That's what they do. Could we move on to some other areas of this particular legislation that actually begin to deliver and see that what the legislation proposes goes into effect, so that we don't run out of time and not get this bill out because we're micromanaging? Thank you.
Well, I think we're, thanks for the giddy up. We're down to our last things on resolving.
Yeah, this is it. That was it.
Okay. Any committee questions about either of the two additional areas of new language? All right. Thank you, Ms. Mahaly. So I will do a couple things. One is to work with Ledge Council. It's Ms. Dexter Cooper, who does the APA stuff and is the LCAR attorney, and on that section of the bill, and also check in with Ms. Murkowski on the stipend stuff, so that we at least send something tidy to appropriations for further work. I think Senator McDonald's point is well taken. Appropriations is very good at taking care of appropriations perspective on any work we send them. They have a lot of practice. So I don't want to get hung up trying to guess what's the best way to express it. So with that, is there any further committee discussion on any of the provisions in the bill? All right. So with that, I would say that I'll have to check. This is a particularly intense time for legislative council, so I can't guarantee that we can have a clean composite draft for tomorrow. So I will, but that would be the goal, would be to have taken the edits from the two sides, come back with language that addresses the APA concerns, and as well as the stipend, and have a votable clean copy for the committee to examine tomorrow. So, and with that, I think we have, we're pretty much there on the bill, unless there's further committee discussion or questions. Okay, the silent majority speaks. With that, we have at 9:30, so 15 minutes from now, Dan French, Secretary French, is coming in to talk to us about S-148 and how it, the implications for Agency of Education. So if we don't have any more on 148. Let me just check with Jude to make sure we still have our witnesses that I'm looking at on the current posted agenda is still up to date. We haven't heard anyone calling in saying they can't come for whatever reason.
Correct.
Okay, great. Well, then, why don't we just take a 10-minute break and come back so that we're here before Secretary French gets in the room, because I know he always comes in and out under tight time constraints. And we can also, when we, and then Susanna Davis is coming in after him. We have a joint assembly at 10:30. If we have some time, I'd love to have a brief conversation with the committee about S230.